Although Herman Melville is now regarded as one of America's most important writers, in his lifetime, after early success with his travel books, his work was panned by the critics, ignored by the buying public, and one newspaper called him crazy. His greatest works were written in bursts of feverish productivity, but as he got older, he went into prolonged slumps of dark depression and wrote little, disillusioned with the world and quietly drifting into obscurity. Welcome to Insane History. I'm Graeme Yorston, and today I'm exploring the colourful but rather tragic life of one of the world's most celebrated writers, Herman Melville. A man whose literary achievements were unappreciated, forcing him to spend 19 years grafting away as a lowly customs inspector instead of writing. A man plagued by frustration and illness, but a man who was able to use his experiences to reveal unprecedented insights into the darker recesses of the human soul. Herman Melville was born in New York in 1819. His father, Alan, was from a prosperous Boston family of merchants, and his mother, Maria Gansevoort, was from a wealthy Dutch family which had been in America for generations. In his early years, the Melvilles enjoyed a privileged and comfortable lifestyle, always moving to bigger and grander houses with plenty of servants to wait on them. Herman, the third born of his parents' 8, was described as a serious child. His father considered him very backwards in speech and somewhat slow in comprehension. But he started school at the age of 6 and made good progress, such that his father was able to proudly note that he proved the best speaker in the introductory department. In 1826 he had scarlet fever, not so dangerous now, but at the time it was a much feared killer of children, with a mortality rate of up to 30%. He survived, but is said to have had weak eyes for the rest of his life as a result. Everything seemed to be going well, but his father had been living beyond his means, making unwise investments and borrowing large sums from his own and his wife's family. And when Herman was 11, it all changed when the Gansevoorts pulled the plug, leaving Alan $20,000 in debt, getting on for $1 million in today's terms. With 3 months' rent unpaid, Alan retreated with his wife and children to Albany, New York, close to Maria's family, where he took a job as a clerk at a cap and fur store, although he tried to give the impression that he was the manager. Herman attended the Albany Academy and was awarded the honour of marching through the town in a procession of the year's finest scholars for his ciphering. At first I found this difficult to understand, as Melville's manuscripts are notoriously difficult to read and full of spelling mistakes. But in the 19th century, ciphering was often used to mean arithmetic. With money tight, Herman had to leave the academy after a year, as his parents couldn't afford the fees. But worse was to come. In December 1831, the Hudson River froze over, and his father, returning from New York, had to travel the last 70 miles in an open carriage for 2 days and nights. He came down with pneumonia, and although he tried to carry on working, his condition worsened. He finally succumbed after weeks of illness and distressing, agitated delirium at the end, all witnessed by the 12-year-old Herman. Money was even tighter now, and his Uncle Peter, a director at the New York State Bank, got him a job as an errand boy. But his brother Gansevoort opened his own cap and fur store and did well enough to hire Herman as his assistant. But just as the family were beginning to get onto a better financial footing, the store and most of his stock were destroyed by a fire. And after more hard work and rebuilding, the financial panic of 1837 put Gansevoort out of business for good. Over this period, Herman tried to continue his education as best he could, and participated in debating societies. But with his brother's business gone, he needed to work. After helping out on another uncle's farm 30 miles away in Pittsfield, Massachusetts, he got a teaching position at a nearby school. He taught around 30 children of various ages, including some his own age, but he left after a term, possibly because some of the older boys threatened to take him outside and give him a thumping. When he was 18, the Melvilles moved to an even cheaper house in Lansingburgh, 11 miles north of Albany, where Herman enrolled at the academy to study surveying and engineering, hoping to find work on the Erie Canal. The job didn't materialise, but around this time he published his first story, Fragments from a Writing Desk, in the local newspaper. A passionate story of a young man obsessed with a ravishing beauty who longs for one long, long kiss upon her hot and glowing lips. Before we launch into the next phase of Melville's life, I'd just like to tell you a little about today's paid collaboration with Holzkern, an Austrian company that for the past decade has specialised in making watches and jewellery for men and women using natural materials, so each piece is unique. If you've seen my video on Egon Schiele, you'll know just how much I love Austrian design. Holzkern are particularly known for their wooden watches, but I chose the gifted watch with the blue marble face and brown leather strap, which I think is rather stylish. I also chose the aquarelle and shade necklaces, which have been very much appreciated by Mrs. Y. And I have to say, this came at exactly the right time, as my last watch had given up the ghost and I was going around feeling a little underdressed. Holzkern products are manufactured in small quantities to ensure responsible and ethical production, and they all come with a 2-year guarantee. If you're worried about shipping costs, don't, as the company offers free express worldwide shipping, with orders typically arriving in 2 to 5 days. They'll even pay customs duties. Click the link in the description and use my code PROFESSOR at checkout to save 15% off your purchases site-wide. Desperate for a job, in June 1839 the 19-year-old Melville signed aboard the merchant ship St. Lawrence as a boy sailing from New York to Liverpool, returning 4 months later, the first of his maritime adventures complete. Back home, he tried teaching again in East Greenbush, New York, but left after a term as the school folded without paying him. Then, inspired by the exciting accounts he had read about whaling expeditions, he travelled to New Bedford, at the time one of the world's most important whaling ports, and signed up as a green hand on the brand new ship, the Acushnet, with 25 other crew members. Sailing south, they spotted whales near the Bahamas and sent out the harpooners. Most of the world now finds the killing of whales barbaric, but at the time they were not romanticised. They were simply viewed as any other natural resource, something to be harvested if you had the mind and the means to do so. Fortunes were made from their valuable oil, which was used in lamps and as a lubricant in fine machinery. Once a whale had been harpooned, it was cut up and the blubber boiled down to produce oil. Each whale took around 3 days and yielded 1 barrel per foot of length. Yields and the quality of oil varied with the species of whale, sperm whales producing the finest and most valuable spermaceti oil, up to 50 barrels each. It was tough work, dirty, smelly, and the conditions on board basic. By March, they had reached Rio de Janeiro and sent back 150 barrels of oil. A month later, they had rounded Cape Horn into the Pacific and were up to the Juan Fernandez Islands off the coast of Chile, where, 130 years earlier, Alexander Selkirk had been marooned by his shipmates. They had success hunting alone and with other American whalers, and after sending back hundreds of barrels of oil, the Acushnet crossed the equator and sailed on to the Galapagos Islands, which Melville later described in the Encantadas. Over the next few months, hundreds more barrels of oil were harvested, and by June 1842 the ship had reached the Marquesas Islands, 2,000 miles south of Hawaii. Fed up with the harsh conditions, Melville and a shipmate decided to jump ship. Not uncommon for the crews of whalers, but a risky plan in Nuku Hiva, as the islands were famous for having cannibal tribes. So famous that 20 years before, the captain of the shipwrecked Essex chose to try for the coast of South America, much further away, rather than risk the cooking pots of the Marquesas. Ironic, really, as the survivors of the Essex resorted to cannibalism themselves. Melville and his companion were soon captured by the Typee tribe, but it seems they were treated more as guests than prisoners, as members of the adorable sex conducted a long and minute investigation of their persons. Just the kind of thing a young man would hate. He later described his experiences in his first book, Typee, in which he demonstrates a great deal of sympathy for the so-called savages and their carefree, innocent way of life, and questions the supposed civilizing of them by missionaries. Exactly what happened during his stay and how much was exaggeration for dramatic effect is unclear. But after a few weeks, he was rescued, if that's the right word, by the short-handed Australian whaler Lucy Ann. When they reached Tahiti, the Lucy Ann's captain, fearful of more desertions, refused to give his crew shore leave, which led to a mutiny, which Melville joined. It wasn't successful, but Melville got off the ship anyway as he was thrown into jail for a while. He managed to escape from Tahiti and spent several weeks drifting around various islands, later drawing on his experiences for his second book, Omoo. In November, he joined the crew of the Nantucket whaler Charles and Henry for 6 months, leaving when the ship reached Hawaii, still an independent kingdom at the time. After 4 months of trying his hand at different jobs in Hawaii, he joined the US Navy as an ordinary seaman on the frigate USS United States, which made its way back to Boston over the next year. Melville's years at sea created what one biographer has described as a settled hatred of external authority, a lust for personal freedom, and a growing and intensifying sense of his own exceptionalism as a person, along with the resentful sense that circumstance and mankind together had already imposed their will upon him in a series of injurious ways. He had been away for almost 5 years, in some of the most far-flung corners of the world. It amassed a lifetime's worth of adventure stories of tyrannical captains, narrow escapes, and exotic, uninhibited natives. Family and friends were fascinated by his colourful tales, and everyone urged him to get them down in writing. So he did, and within a few months he had completed Typee, his first book, which was published in 1846 in London and a month later in New York. It was an instant bestseller, his descriptions of the carefree Polynesian girls proving especially popular. And it remained his most successful book in his lifetime, selling around 16,000 copies and turning him into a minor celebrity, who was thereafter known as the man who had lived among the cannibals. But just a few months later, he received news from London that his brother Gansevoort had died at the age of 30, having written him a very depressed-sounding letter. It's not clear what happened, but a rather bleak and mortuary notice reported that he died of an affection of the main artery of the throat, and that his sickness was protracted and painful. The following year, Omoo was published, a sequel to Typee using the Tahitian word for someone who travels between islands. He was paid £150 by his London publisher, and the book was equally successful. Subtitled A Narrative of Adventures in the South Seas, like Typee, it contains a mixture of his own experiences, sometimes rather embellished, and a kind of anthropological exploration of Polynesian culture that was rapidly disappearing in the push to civilise the islands. In 1847, at the age of 28, Melville married Elizabeth Shaw, the daughter of Lemuel Shaw, Chief Justice of Massachusetts and a close friend of Melville's father. Like most things Melville did, it was all very quick. He had only known her a few months, and after a honeymoon in Canada, they settled in New York City, buying a house jointly with his younger brother Alan, close to Grace Church on 4th Avenue. Lizzie was a quiet, unassuming woman who was happy to keep house and perform such tasks of drudgery as mending his socks and shielding him from the unpleasantness of everyday life and giving him space to write and visit bookshops and art galleries. But she found time to make house calls on upwardly mobile friends and neighbours. And she had a sense of humour, writing to a friend that she had not yet got used to her new estate.
It seems sometimes exactly as if I were here for a visit. The illusion is quite dispelled, however, when Herman walks into my room without even the ceremony of knocking, bringing me perhaps a button to sew on or some equally romantic occupation.
The following year, his third book, Mardi, was published. It seems to have begun as a straightforward South Seas adventure, a quest for a beautiful native woman. But it expanded into a rambling political and philosophical satire with large sections that have little or nothing to do with the central story. And Lizzie was already beginning to worry about her new husband, as he would spend long hours at his desk without pausing for food or drink. Mardi was a critical failure. One reviewer said the book contained ideas in so thick a haze that we are unable to perceive distinctly which is which. When first submitted to his publisher, the reader praised the first part of the book, but warned that later chapters were quite delirious and seemed to have been written by a madman. In 1849, their first child, Malcolm, was born, increasing the financial pressure for Melville to get back to winning ways after the failure of Mardi. And in a burst of feverish energy, he produced 2 further novels in just 4 months. An incredible achievement, given that he was having to share his home with his mother, sisters, his brother Alan, with his wife and child. Redburn, a semi-autobiographical tale of the adventures of a refined young man amongst earthy and intemperate sailors in the seedier parts of Liverpool. The bankruptcy and death of his father, and how his world was turned upside down by this, also appear thinly disguised in the novel. Although he was consciously aiming to produce a more commercial work, no metaphysics, no conic sections, nothing but cakes and ale, as he put it, both books have darker undertones than his previous works. His long hours of working put a strain on his eyes, which he described as tender as young sparrows. His fifth book, White Jacket, which appeared in 1850 and was based on his experiences in the Navy, is a no-holds-barred condemnation of the stupidity and barbarity of naval discipline. Both books were well received by the critics and regarded as a return to form after Mardi, but sales were modest. White Jacket had a lasting impact, however, in that its shocking descriptions of the brutality of flogging inspired Senator John P. Hale to persuade Congress to ban the practice the same year. Melville then embarked on his next project, described by one biographer as the most ambitious book ever conceived by an American writer. And by May 1850, he told a fellow author that he was halfway through it and promised his publisher it would be ready by the autumn. But in the summer, he took a vacation in the Berkshire Hills with his wife and 2-year-old son. And although he was intending to stay for only a short time, something made him decide to uproot his family from New York and make a permanent move to the country. There has been speculation as to what prompted this impulsive decision. Was it meeting Nathaniel Hawthorne, an intellectual soulmate, on a picnic one day? Or Sarah Morwood, an aspiring poet who had a reputation for being witty and flirty and behaving rather indecorously for a married woman. The Morwoods bought the 250-acre farm in Pittsfield previously owned by Melville's uncle. And in the same month, Melville borrowed $3,000 from his father-in-law to buy the 160-acre farm adjoining theirs. It has been suggested that they had a passionate affair, and that it was his own dangerous obsession with an unattainable married woman that Melville was depicting in Moby Dick. Others have suggested that it was Hawthorne's intellect and artistry that Melville was infatuated with. Hawthorne was 15 years older than Melville, but still largely unknown. But after reading his short story collection, Melville wrote an enthusiastic review in the literary world, describing it as shrouded in blackness, 10 times black, and comparing him to Shakespeare. The shy and reclusive Hawthorne lived just 5 miles away, and Melville would often visit unannounced, and they would spend the day smoking and talking metaphysics. But they were temperamentally quite different, and Hawthorne found Melville's manic intensity exhausting at times. Others have gone further and found sexual excitement in the letters Melville wrote to him. I feel that this Hawthorne has dropped germinous seeds into my soul. He expands and deepens down the more I contemplate him, and further shoots his strong New England roots into the hot soil of my southern soul. You can understand why people have interpreted this in a sexual way, but Melville was never one for saying anything simply. And it strikes me that the seeds could just as well have been of the creative variety as any other. He called his new home Arrowhead after the artefacts that were turned up by ploughing. It was a busy home, as he was soon joined by extended family, and he had to create a refuge for himself in his second-floor study and library with views overlooking Mount Greylock. Whether it was the influence of Hawthorne or Sarah Morwood, or whether he was already going in that direction anyway, we don't know. But Moby Dick moved way beyond being just a run-of-the-mill sea yarn to a work which explored the much deeper themes of existence, obsession and revenge, to become a parable on the mystery of evil and the accidental malice of the universe, as his first biographer Lewis Mumford put it. Whatever the cause of his excitement, Melville rewrote Moby Dick in an exhilarated, almost frenzied state, spending hours at his desk, rarely pausing for food, and this impatient energy comes through in the text. Give me a condor's quill, give me Vesuvius's crater for an inkstand. And around the same time, he asked a friend to supply 50 fast-writing youths, because since I've been here, I have planned about that number of future works and can't find enough time to think about them separately. It has been suggested that Moby Dick shows flight of ideas, a characteristic mental state of people during an episode of mania, in which they talk fast and rapidly change topic, introducing new ideas that are often only tangentially connected. As a psychiatrist, this is something one encounters all the time, and it's very distinctive. And I have to say that within the first few pages of Moby Dick, there are wild flights of imagination and digressions that are difficult to follow, even with a classical dictionary open in front of you. Melville's magnum opus was published in Britain as The Whale in October 1851 in 3 volumes, with passages deemed blasphemous edited out, and missing its crucial epilogue. It appeared in the US a month later as a single volume, but with its epilogue intact, and with its title changed to Moby Dick. In Britain, most reviews were positive. John Bull was pleasantly surprised to find philosophy in whales and poetry in blubber, and concluded that few books that claimed to be either philosophical or literary works contain as much true philosophy and as much genuine poetry as the tale of the Pequod's whaling expedition, making it a work far beyond the level of an ordinary work of fiction. The Morning Post found it one of the cleverest, wittiest and most amusing of modern books. The more conservative Athenaeum, however, described it as an ill-compounded mixture of romance and matter-of-fact, and felt the style of his tale is in places disfigured by mad rather than bad English. This was not the last time Melville would be called mad, and it didn't sell well in Britain, fewer than 500 copies, and made a loss for his publisher Richard Bentley. American reviews, many written by people who had not even read the book, tended to echo the more negative British ones. Those who actually read it found much to praise, but often expressed reservations about its irreverence and profane jesting, and the Boston Post called it a crazy sort of affair. I recall trying to read Moby Dick as a 17-year-old. The book was part of a grandly named series called Books That Have Changed Man's Thinking. and I'd battled my way through Jean-Paul Sartre, so I wasn't anticipating any problems with a 19th century adventure story. But oh dear, was I wrong. I spent most of my time looking up obscure whaling terms in the dictionary, and I'm not sure I ever did get to the end. Sadly, Melville never saw the more positive British reviews and was soon busy at home as his second son Stanwix was born just as it was published. And his health wasn't great. He had further attacks of eye pain and sensitivity to light, which made him creep about like an owl. The symptoms were so persistent he had a porch built on the north side of the house so he could read outside in the shade, and at times his eyes would be as tender as pigeons' eggs. But there was no time to dwell on the reception of Moby Dick. He was already on to his next book. He told his publisher it had unquestionable novelty and was very much more calculated for popularity than his previous works, being a regular romance with a mysterious plot to it and stirring passions. Pierre, or the Ambiguities, tells the story of Pierre Glendinning, whose yearning for a sister is seemingly realised on the eve of his marriage. But he is forced to choose between acknowledging his illegitimate half-sister or maintaining the family name. Although he may have started with the idea of writing a Gothic romance, he ended up producing an intense psychological portrait of the moods, motivations, and thought processes of a young man wrestling with a complex moral dilemma, with some discursive philosophical sections and a bit of ranting and raving thrown in for good measure. The book portrays the idealism of youth and the unhappy consequences of sticking to a well-intentioned but impractical course of action. And it treads on, for the time, very dangerous ground of repressed sexuality and incestuous feelings. If Moby Dick's reception was lukewarm, Pierre was met with outright hostility. The New York Daybook published a venomous attack on the author as a mock news story headed "Herman Melville Crazy." The book is likened to the ravings and reveries of a madman and claims that Melville was deranged and that his friends were taking measures to place him under treatment. It was turned down by his British publisher and sold fewer than 2,000 copies in America, making him precisely $157. Although it has always been considered a difficult book, controversial psychologist Henry Murray describing it as a miscellany of grammatical eccentricities, convoluted sentences, neologisms, and verbal fetishisms. Its fans regard it as one of the earliest books to have a deeply introspective focus, ahead of its time and anticipating some of Sigmund Freud's ideas on sexuality. It was long thought that the failure of these two books sent Melville into a slump, and that he barely picked up his pen afterwards. But it seems he did continue writing and completed a now lost work, Isle of the Cross, with a central female character, although scholars are divided on whether this was a short story or a full-length novel. In 1853, his third child and first daughter Bessie was born. We know surprisingly little about his reaction to his expanding family, but with less money coming in from his writing, supper in the household was sometimes no more than tea and toast. His next book, Israel Potter, is a story about the unlucky adventures of a veteran of the American Revolutionary War, and his struggle to get back to his home, and how, after 50 years of being away, nothing is quite the same when he does make it back, and his name is forgotten. After the abject failure of Pierre, he had difficulty finding a publisher, and it was serialised in Putnam's Monthly in 1854, a new literary magazine that focused on publishing American authors. Once again, reviews were mixed, the Boston Christian Examiner saying, "His character, in truth, lacks those elements which arrest and enchain the reader's sympathies, and, at best, it is only a feeble delineation of a very commonplace person." The London Leader, however, considered it the best work that Mr. Melville has yet written. But from now on, Melville's periods of illness became more severe and more protracted. As well as sore eyes, he developed sciatica, and at times he had great difficulty sitting at his writing desk or carrying out any work on the farm. He was treated by Dr. Oliver Wendell Holmes, poet and physician, but his casebooks do not survive. He could be bedridden for weeks on end with back and hip pain, which he called ugly attacks. But between these episodes, he was able to work as normal, and at the end of 1855 he proposed to the new owners of Putnam's that they publish a collection of his short stories, the Piazza Tales, some old and some new, including Benito Cereno and the extraordinary Bartleby the Scrivener, a story about a Wall Street lawyer who hires a new clerk, who, after an initial period of satisfactory hard work, suddenly refuses to make any further copies of documents or do any other task required of him, responding to all requests with a simple, "I would prefer not to." The reason for the clerk's behaviour is never explained, leaving it open to interpretation. Some have suggested Melville is portraying severe depression, some that the clerk is autistic, others that it is an inquiry into the ethics of business, or an autobiographical account of Melville's own struggles and disillusionment with the literary world. I hadn't read this one before researching this video, and I have to say it's a truly unique story. Strangely unsettling and modern considering it was written 170 years ago. His next book, The Confidence Man, set on a Mississippi steamboat, has the reputation of being one of Melville's most difficult books to read, and the writing of it took a toll on his health. He suffered further ugly attacks of rheumatism and sciatica, and everyone was worried, saying he looked dispirited and ill. And to help ease the rheumatic pains, Melville turned to alcohol. Exactly how much and how reliant upon it he was is a matter of debate, but it was enough for people to comment. His father-in-law was also concerned about the impact of his health on his daughter's well-being, blaming it on his hard study for days on end with little or no exercise. So concerned that he advanced him $1,500 from Lizzie's inheritance to go off on a 6-month trip to Europe and the Holy Land. The first stop was Glasgow, and then Liverpool, where he met up with Nathaniel Hawthorne, who had taken the position of United States Consul. Hawthorne felt he was much overshadowed and affected with neuralgical complaints in the head and limbs, and described their conversation in his journal. Melville, as he always does, began to reason of providence and futurity, and of everything that lies beyond human ken, and informed me that he had pretty much made up his mind to be annihilated. And it was in this state that he continued his trip. He sailed through the Greek islands and visited Athens, but became disillusioned with classical mythology, a subject he had always loved. Constantinople made him anxious for his wallet. Egypt and the pyramids puzzled him, and when he reached Jerusalem, he struggled with his religious doubts. His journal reflects his inability to see anything good. Thoughts in the Via Dolorosa? Women panting under burdens, men with melancholy faces, the city besieged by an army of the dead, cemeteries all around. His description of his excursion to Bethlehem is no less bleak. Barrenness of Judea, whitish mildew pervading whole tracts of landscape, bleached, leprosy, encrustation of curse, old cheese, bones of rocks, crunched, gnawed and mumbled, mere refuse and rubbish of creation. He also had a relapse of his painful eye condition, which he attributed to riding in the desert sun. And 2 months later in Italy, he suffered another episode of eye pain associated with general incapacity and a singular pain in the chest and back. While he was away, The Confidence Man was published on April Fool's Day 1857, a darkly satirical novel about a Mississippi con artist determined to expose the selfishness of human nature. In modern times, it has been hailed as a complex psychological exploration of issues of identity and honesty, but when it appeared, reviews varied from bewilderment to outright hostility. Many have concluded that Melville's depressed mood and physical ailments while he was writing it must have influenced its pessimistic and misanthropic tone. After his return, and having suffered another failure in terms of sales, Melville began to accept that he needed to find a different way of making money. So he started writing poetry and embarked on public lecturing, speaking about classical antiquities, sightseeing in Rome, and his travels in the South Seas. But his lectures did not go down well. One attendee complaining that his words died in his moustaches, coming through about as loud and with as much force as the creaking of a field mouse through a thick hedge. In 3 years he earned around $1,200, less than a third of what Emerson had made in a single season. And between his lecture tours he had further bouts of back pain, headaches and eye pain, and at some point he was unable to read. It was not just his delivery that was the problem. The Civil War was looming, but he completely ignored this and carried on talking about Roman statues and Polynesian customs. Another attendee found Melville a disappointed man, soured by criticism and disgusted with the civilized world and with Christendom in general. His countenance flushed from whisky. In 1860, he transferred ownership of Arrowhead to his father-in-law, as there was no realistic prospect of him paying his debts. In the same year, he submitted a poetry collection to a publisher, but it was not accepted and is now lost. In an effort to restore his spirits, he embarked on a trip to California around Cape Horn aboard a clipper under the command of his brother Tom. But he now found he was stricken with such bad seasickness that he found it difficult to read. And no sooner had he reached San Francisco than he returned via Panama, his health unimproved and still plagued by periods of eye pain, headaches and sciatica. But he also had periods of being physically and mentally active, at least until 1862, when he was thrown from his carriage, breaking his shoulder blade and several ribs. One of his neighbours described its impact on him. This prolonged agony and the confinement and interruption of work which it entailed affected him strangely. He had before been on mountain excursions, a driver daring to the point of recklessness. After this accident, he not only abandoned the rides of which he had been so fond, but for a time shrank from entering a carriage. It was long before the shock which his system had received was overcome, and it is doubtful whether it was ever complete. On his recovery, Melville characteristically wrote, "I once cherished a loose sort of notion that I did not care to live very long. But I will frankly own that I have now no serious, no insuperable objections to a respectable longevity. I don't like the idea of being left out night after night in a cold churchyard." But he was done with being a farmer, and the following year he struck a deal with his brother, swapping Arrowhead, which had come back to Lizzie following her father's death, for his house in New York City. In 1864, Melville visited the Virginia battlefields of the American Civil War, and when it was over, he published a collection of 72 poems, battle pieces and aspects of the war. Now regarded as a major work, critics at the time were at best lukewarm, and some were appalled by the poem's metrical irregularity, unusual diction and slant rhymes, and it did not do well commercially. Of the print run of 1,260 copies, less than half were sold. During the Civil War, he had lobbied for a government job in Washington. Nothing came of it, but in December 1866 he was offered a job as a deputy inspector for the U.S. Customs Service at $4 a day, a post he held for 19 years, and he had a reputation for honesty in a notoriously corrupt institution. He had hoped his return to New York would have allowed him to return to the city's literary life, but working 6 days a week at the kind of job he once described as worse than driving geese gave him little time or energy for anything else. In May 1867, his wife's family, fearing for his sanity and aware that he was ill-treating her, tried to arrange for her to leave him and state in court that he was insane, but Lizzie could not go along with the plan. What the ill-treatment consisted of we don't know. One of Lizzie's nieces later said that he was violent and that her aunt was not always safe, and that he hated his sons, but was kinder to his daughters. Whether this had anything to do with events that unfolded a few months later is not clear, but their 18-year-old son Malcolm died in his bedroom from a self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. The jury at the inquest was in no doubt that it was intentional, but their verdict was later changed when new evidence was brought to save the family's reputation, as dying by your own hand carried an enormous stigma at this time. I think this is one of the worst things that can happen to a parent. The pain, the self-blame, the if-onlys never go away. And not surprisingly, Melville's relationship with his wife deteriorated further. But somehow he kept working, plodding along as a customs inspector and quietly working on his epic poem Clarel, inspired by his trip to the Holy Land. At 18,000 lines, it is one of the longest poems ever written by an American writer, and it was finally published in 1876 with the bequest from his uncle funding the printing of 350 copies. It was barely noticed by the critics, but the New York Times suggested it should have been written in prose, while the World commented that Melville had got lost in the overwhelming tide of mediocrity. His wife described him during the writing of Clarel as
being in a frightfully nervous state. If ever this dreadful incubus of a book gets off Herman's shoulders, I do hope he may be in better mental health, but at present I have reason to feel the gravest concern and anxiety about it.
he also had to battle his eye pain, which was so bad at times he was unable to use his eyes at all. By now he was a broken man. An observer in the 1870s was struck by his timidity. In the flesh, he did not show either strength or determination. On the contrary, he was the quietest, meekest, modestest, retiringest man you can imagine. Melville was reclusive in old age. In 1882, he declined an invitation to join the Authors' Club, which was being established to promote social intercourse amongst authors, describing himself as a hermit and pleading that his nerves could no longer stand large gatherings. And in truth, he had little money for anything but the necessities of life. This improved in 1884 when Lizzie received a legacy that enabled her to buy him a steady stream of books and prints each month, and he was able to retire on December 31st, 1885. But more tragedy was in store. Less than 2 months later, Stanwix, their younger son, died in San Francisco at the age of 36 from tuberculosis. In his few remaining years, he would go closer to his long-suffering Lizzie, finally realising he would never have been able to keep going without her. He published 2 collections of poems inspired by his early experiences at sea, intended mainly for his relatives and friends, John Marr and Other Sailors in 1888, and Timoleon in 1891. And he was often seen out walking around the city. Before the end, he had a modest revival of popularity in Britain when readers rediscovered his novels. But after increasing bouts of ill health from which he emerged progressively weaker, he died peacefully at home in 1891 at the age of 72. He was buried in the Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, with few in attendance. His passing was acknowledged in the New York Times, and although it misspelled his masterpiece as Moby Dick, it published a fuller appreciation of his life and work a few days later. The New York Mail and Express also noted his passing and acknowledged there was a wealth of imagination in the mind of Mr. Melville, but also strange, dark, mysterious elements in his nature which he never learned to control. He left unpublished at the time of his death a volume of poetry, Weeds and Wildings with a Rose or Two, dedicated to his wife, and a sketch of Daniel Orme. Lizzie also found pages for an unfinished novella, Billy Budd, which he had revised and rearranged several times, but left the pages in disarray. Lizzie attempted to edit the manuscript for publication, but could not decide her husband's intentions, or even read his handwriting, and abandoned the effort, leaving the pages in a family bread box until the 1920s, when a hasty transcription was published. More authoritative editions have followed, and it has been adapted as a stage play and a powerful opera by Benjamin Britten and a film. There is a wisdom that is woe, but there is a woe that is madness. And there is a Catskill eagle in some souls that can alike dive down into the blackest gorges and soar out of them again and become invisible in the sunny spaces. Is this passage from Moby Dick Herman Melville talking about his own periodic melancholies and highs? If so, it is one of the first descriptions of what we now call bipolar affective disorder. Until the mid-19th century, mania and melancholy was considered separate conditions with different causes and treatments. But in 1851, the very year Moby Dick was published, Jean-Pierre Falret, a French psychiatrist, published a case description of what he called la folie circulaire, or cyclical madness. And this gradually evolved over the next 100 years into manic depression and eventually the modern concept of bipolar mood disorder. There are claims that many artists, writers and performers have bipolar disorder, some of them without much in the way of convincing evidence. But I think the case for Melville having the disorder is a strong one. His periods of melancholy were incapacitating, and in his phases of high energy, he was incredibly creative and productive, but sometimes in a way that is difficult for non-Catskill eagles, otherwise known as ordinary human beings, to follow. The case is made even stronger when his family history is considered. As well as his possibly bipolar father, both his mother and maternal grandmother suffered from severe depression. A maternal aunt died in an asylum. One maternal uncle suffered from depression and another from alcoholism, as did 3 cousins. His brother Gansevoort may have suffered from mania before his death, although this was more likely to have been delirium associated with tuberculosis. Another brother, Alan, had depressive tendencies and alcohol issues, and his sister Kate may have had obsessive-compulsive disorder. Quite an inheritance. Studies have shown higher rates of bipolar illness in creative people, but it's a difficult area to research, as who gets to decide if someone is creative or not? There has also been a suggestion that Melville was autistic. His early language delay, clumsiness, preference for routines, natural solitariness and idiosyncratic use of language are cited as evidence in support of this. Another recently proposed diagnosis is that he had post-traumatic stress disorder after he was thrown from his carriage in 1862. Of course, none of these disorders are mutually exclusive, and it is quite possible that he could have had 2 or even all 3. But it does seem that everyone who knew him believed his periods of illness, his headaches, eye pains and sciatica, to have been psychological or hypochondriacal in nature, brought on by overwork. Another interesting possibility, however, is that he may have had an autoimmune condition known as ankylosing spondylitis that causes episodic joint pain, often accompanied by painful inflamed eyes. Of course, we'll never be certain which, if any, condition Melville had. But if the frenzied energy of his writing was indeed a reflection of a manic state, it is an interesting question as to whether his greatest works would ever have been written, or written in the same way, if modern treatments had been available to him. I suspect his patient and loyal Lizzie might have had an easier life, though. Thank you for watching. If you want to read more about Herman Melville, then there are lots of biographies to choose from, as well as more academic explorations of particular facets of his life. I'll add my favourites to my Amazon store page, along with links to his greatest works, just in case I've whetted your appetite. As always, I'd love to hear your views on this video. And if you're interested in supporting the channel and helping it grow, then we've just launched a membership, which you can join by clicking on below or in the description. But apart from that, I'll say goodbye for now, and I hope to see you again soon. Goodbye.